getting started. Continue. Okay, we're all up and running now officially. All right, so those of you that just came in, apparently, even though I posted the solutions into Canvas on the quizzes, apparently you can't see them, and apparently I can't find a way to view them, so I'm just going to, I guess, just have to do it the old-fashioned way and cut and paste it and send it to you via email. So I'll get on that this next week. Okay, so the new stuff today, I'm going to go ahead and kind of pre-warn you. The first two quizzes in this class, super easy. This one's going to be a little bit more complex, okay? So last week was obviously kind of a gift. This week, not as much, okay? A little bit more detail, a little bit more complexity and that sort of thing. Not a threat, just simply letting you know so that you can kind of prepare yourself, all right? So, the first thing that we're going to talk about conceptually is construction loans. Now, if you took the real estate finance course, we did a little bit about construction loans there, and we're kind of revisiting it a little bit because obviously your textbook does, and also I think it's good to kind of reinforce some of this. And this whole chapter, to a certain extent, deals with some of the issues that you face as a developer and ultimately coming up with not only your development budget and construction loan, but also dealing with issues related to sort of project cost and kind of things like going in cap rate, going out cap rate, and a handful of other things. But, so I'll basically say this. There are probably 3 or 4 of the questions that are on the quiz, super easy. The other probably 5 or 6, not so much, okay? So just kind of be aware of that. All right, so this first piece, negative amortization and construction loans. Whenever you get a construction loan, you, in essence, are, it's like a line of credit, much like getting a line of credit on a credit card, all right? And you're told by your lender, you have, let's say, $1 million line of credit for this project that you want to build, all right? And you don't get that $1 million all up front, all right? You get it basically in pieces, or what are called draws, okay, over time. Meaning that whenever you complete little bits and pieces of the construction process, in other words, you pour the foundation, and get all the concrete work done. Okay, then you go in, you take your receipts from the contractor that did the concrete work to the lender and say, okay, hey, I need, $100,000 to basically pay that contractor for having done that work. Okay, and that happens, let's say, in the first month. Then the next month, you've got folks that are coming in, maybe doing, framing or brickwork or whatever it may be. Same process, but the reality is you don't get, once again, that entire amount up front. You get it piecemeal based upon what has been done during the construction process. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Okay, so this is different than most loans you are probably familiar with respect to like car loans and home loans and things like that, where you get a big lump sum out, you buy an asset, and you make payments, for a certain number of months or years. With the construction loan, as I said, it's much more like a credit card. If you don't use it, then you don't have to pay, okay? Much like with the construction loan, you get $1 million line of credit. If it only cost you $800,000 to build your building, you only have to pay for the $800,000 that, in essence, you borrow, okay, plus interest cost. Okay, does that make sense? Everybody cool with that? Conceptually. All right, so let's make an assumption that we are going to buy a property, buy the land, let's say, and let's say that our land costs are, I don't know, $500,000. And let's say that in addition to the land cost, we're going to have construction cost of, let's say, $75,000 a month for 12 months. Okay? And let's say that our cost of borrowing on this is going to be 8% interest rate. Or, once again, cost of borrowing. So in this particular scenario, let's just sort of think about what's happening. If we kind of look at this as sort of a timeline over 12 months, all right, here at time period 0, we are spending $500,000, and then each month we are also spending $75,000. And so forth, so on, all the way out. Even in the last month, we have our final sort of payout at the end of the 12th month. Okay, so in this example, we don't have any cash inflows. We're not receiving any money during this time, okay? This is all sort of outgoings. Now, in this particular instance, I'm going to actually call this an ADC loan. An ADC loan is, in essence, an acquisition, sort of development, and construction loan. All kind of rolled into one. Now, here's the thing. Once again, those of you that took the real estate finance class, you know loans can take on all different shapes, sizes, forms, styles. This particular sort of loan is a little bit different than just a standard normal construction loan, in that this loan is also going to include the ability to pay for maybe the land, okay, and other sort of costs incurred on this property. So in other words, you can sort of think about it, assuming you could get one of these sorts of loans based upon your credit and your history and so forth, so on, but it's sort of like getting 100% financing, or close to it, okay? Maybe not pure 100% financing, but pretty darn close in the sense that it will allow you to pay for a significant piece of the acquisition cost. Maybe not all of it, but in this particular instance, we're going to kind of make that assumption just to kind of keep it relatively straightforward. All right. So what we want to know in this particular instance is, in essence, how much are we going to owe to the lender that we're going to have to pay out to the lender at the end of that 12-month period, assuming the overall sort of cost of borrowing of 8%. Okay, does everybody understand the general setup and framework on this? Now, in this particular instance, kept it relatively straightforward, and on the quiz this will be one of the more straightforward ones, in the sense that You're going to have consistent cash flows for all 12 months. You're going to have your initial sort of cash outflow of the $500,000, and ultimately we are going to be solving for what? Future value. Okay? So to set this up on the calculator, this is going to be 12 payments per year because it's monthly. Okay? Kind of clear everything out once you've put in the fact that it's monthly. All right? Then what we're going to do is we're going to have the $500,000, and that is going to be a negative number, so we're going to have to use the change sign key. Then we're putting that in as our first cash flow. Then the subsequent cash flows, well, actually we don't have to do that. Okay, let me back up a step. Because this has the same dollar amount each year, we can actually avoid having to use the cash flow function. We'll just make it easier on you. In this case, we'll just have this as our present value. Okay? And then each individual payment that we make of $75,000, which will also be a negative number, that will be our payment amount. And this is occurring over 12 months, so 12 in, or you could put it in as one shift in. Either way, because if you put it in as 12 in, it simply says that's 12 months. If you put it one shift in, that simply is going to convert it from 1 year into 12 months. So you have the choice either way on that one. Then our interest rate is 8%. And so what we're solving for is how much are we going to owe the lender sort of at the end of this period, or our future value. All right, so let's see what we've got. We should end up with 1475,244.20. So $1,475,244.20. Okay, does everybody get that? Okay, now just to kind of get back to this issue of the negative amortization, okay, how much did we actually borrow? Okay, were to just simply ask a simple question, okay, so you've got 75,000 times 12.
900.
That would be 900,000 plus the 500,000 acquisition. So that is going to be 1,400,000. So the difference between those two of basically $75,244.20 is what?
Interest.
Our interest cost. Okay? Now the quiz, I'm probably not going to ask you for the interest cost. I'm really going to probably just be focused on what is the total amount that you owe on the loan. Now what I want to try to kind of just express here, this sort of interest cost, another way to sort of look at this is it's kind of like the concept of negative amortization, and what I want you to sort of get in the context of what we talked about in the real estate finance class as it related to negative amortization. That was more of a situation of where, because you are not making maybe a full payment on a loan because the lender has said you're distressed in some way, you're unable to make the full and complete payment that you owe this month. In essence, you end up owing more because you haven't made your payment. Okay, that is one form of negative amortization. But also here, in the sense of you're not making really any payments at all, therefore what's happening is you're not only going to owe all of what you owe in terms of the 1.4 million, but you also are going to incur sort of these additional sort of interest costs on all of these payments, and that's another form of sort of negative amortization, or in other words, you're going to end up owing obviously more than you're actually borrowing, okay? Now, in this case, for this example, yeah, your total cost of borrowing are $75,000. Now, just for a moment, think about this in the context of if you had received that 1.4 million at the beginning of the year in one big lump sum. You knew that was going to be what you needed, and you had managed to just basically remove all of that money from the bank, you know, and literally it's in your possession now and you can give it out in $100 bills or whatever. Think about how much you would actually owe, all right? Well, in that case, with an 8% interest rate over 1 year, you would owe something like $112,000 worth of interest versus the $75,000 that you actually do owe, okay? And so my point with this is, why is this number so much less? In other words, why is this so much less than the $112,000, the $75,000? Because you are delaying the time in which you access the money and you become liable for it. Does that make sense? In other words, instead of charging on your credit cards, so to speak, all 1.4 million at the beginning of the year, what you're doing is charging bit by bit, month by month, smaller dollar amounts. Therefore, over time, you're going to owe less money. Now, hopefully all of that seems very fundamental, very basic, and it is. This is, in my mind, the lesson that you want to try to take away from that. And this is where it can be very complicated and very controversial, I guess would be the best way to sort of express it. So let's say that I am the developer and you are the subcontractors that are being paid each month, okay? So at the beginning of this whole thing, yeah, I borrow the $500,000, you know, for the acquisition of the property. But you come in and you do your work. You expect to be paid, obviously, as soon as you pretty much submit me an invoice, okay? But what is my motivation as the developer? What is my motivation?
To delay the outflow of cash.
Perfect, okay? So James has hit it right on the head. Very simple concept, but also this is probably where it can become some of the most contentious within this process, because especially, you know, and it doesn't even matter sometimes whether it's small-scale developers or large-scale developers. Why would I, as a developer, want to pay this money as an outflow to my subcontractors any sooner than I absolutely have to? Okay? And from the developer's point of view, I would love to push out all of these payments by an extra 30 days, or an extra 45 days, or an extra, 60 days, because what does that mean to me? Less interest cost, okay, which is less overall cost for the developer. And especially, now in this case, we're dealing with, the same dollar amount each month to kind of keep the problem simple, but what if the majority of my development costs are up front within the first 2 or 3 months? Would I not want to try to push those as far out into the future as I possibly can? Now, you as contractors, are you going to like that? No. Why? You need to pay your folks that are doing the actual work. You don't want to necessarily be having to wait 30, 45 days, 2 months to actually get paid, for a job that you've already completed, okay? So that's where I want to kind of take the discussion here for just a moment. So James, since you're the one that obviously honed in on it immediately, give me your thoughts about this from the developer's perspective and from the contractor side. Any other kind of insights or perspective?
Yeah, well, the big issue is what does it cost you? So from a contractor's perspective, he's going to look at, okay, what is his outflow of cash costing him per month? So many of the contractors will have a line of credit that they work from. So if that cost of using that money is relatively cheap, then they may be willing to go 45 to 60 days. For the developer, since he's delaying the outflow of cash, then what he's in essence doing is he's actually increasing his internal rate of return because he's delaying the number of outflows of cash further into the future than he would have done up front.
Okay, perfect. Now, you said something there that is absolutely golden, and that is on the contractor side, they also probably have to take out some sort of a line of credit, potentially to be able to pay their people, because they know they're going to have to wait for the money from the developer. So, if you're really thinking about this, all of you, who is the big winner in all of this?
The developer.
No. The lender.
No, because he's getting on both sides.
Yeah, he's getting on both sides. The lender is getting not only basically the interest from the developer for, in essence, borrowing the money for the development itself, but also is potentially getting fees from the contractors for having, if they have to borrow money short term to be able to meet payroll costs or other ancillary costs and materials and whatever else. So, in one sense, the kind of lender is winning on both fronts, or is certainly, they're to a certain extent almost indifferent, on, what actually happens. But the big issue, and I think, James has hit on it, is, it's also important to think about that relationship between the developer and these different contractors that are potentially being used, because clearly developers, just like anybody, end up with reputations as to how they treat their contractors. And so if you have a developer that is known for, as soon as the job is done, they get paid, and it's all fair, very quick and painless, versus a developer that's known for, okay, you submit an invoice and it's going to take 60 days, 90 days, whatever to get paid, and then there's going to be arguing, bickering over little details and that sort of thing, then, over time, what's going to probably happen is, that developer's going to maybe find it harder to maybe get contractors to be, loyal to them, and to, in many instances, want to work with them, for lack of a better word. Kip, did you have I sort of see you smiling or smirking as I was saying this. So what thoughts are going through your mind? You're muted.
Yeah, it's just what he said about all the delays in payment, especially all the way down to the subcontractors. They need to wait for the general contractor to be paid. There's a lot of bickering going over the pay apps every month. We have to walk through the job and check, is there actually 40% of the electrical work in, things like that.
Yeah.
But that's why they're getting a down payment at the beginning of the job always.
In some cases, but not always. One of my good friends and former business partners, he is actually in the middle of a renovation job of a mid-sized sort of multi-family project, and right now. And one of the things that he ran into, he decided, to go with a painting contractor that obviously got the low bid, But the problem is they have gotten extreme with what they're calling change orders, but in reality, they're not really change orders, they're simply, here's how I want you to do the job, kind of thing. And in terms of the approach to the job, not so much, I'm wanting you to do something differently, you know, or in addition to what you've been contracted to do. And so the issue, and for those of you that aren't familiar with what change orders are, that you typically will go out, you'll get a bid for something to be done, whether it's painting, whether it's plumbing, electrical, mechanical, whatever, and that contractor will give you a bid. Sometimes it will be structured as it's, you know, labor plus materials with a little bit of an add-on on top of it in terms of percentage. Sometimes it's a fixed price bid of just simply saying it's going to be $10,000 or $100,000 or whatever it is, you know, to get the job done. Well, a lot of times what will happen with these fixed price bids, you know, saying that once again the job is going to be a $100,000 job, is that the contractor will come in, they will, you know, do what they think needs to be done, but maybe they don't do it according to how maybe the developer or you know, would want it to be done in terms of the quality of materials or something that maybe wasn't, I don't know, somehow specified. And so all of a sudden, they can come back and maybe say, okay, you're changing something that's different than what we bid on, and then potentially issue what is called a change order. Well, contractors, as a general rule, and I don't want to make this sound negative, I want to say, you know, ordinarily I would sort of use the word they're notorious for. Well, they are noted for, in many instances, taking advantage of change orders. In other words, you may get a low bid on the job, but then you say, okay, you know, I want you to use, or, you know, if you're talking about something more substantive, I want you to use a different type of hardware on the doors than maybe was previously bid in the job, and so you're going to upgrade the hardware. Well, most of us would tend to think, okay, if that's all you're doing, then, you know, you're simply going to go out, buy the new hardware, and you're going to basically adjust the bid for that, you know, new hardware. But it might actually be the case that this particular contractor sort of says, you know what, I am going to sort of take advantage of this opportunity because this is a change, so instead of just charging you for the cost of the upgrade of the hardware, I'm going to maybe quadruple the actual cost of what what my costs are to make that change. And so what happens is that with some of these lower bidders is they know inherently that change orders are going to happen, and they sort of see the change orders as the way to really get enhanced, increased sort of profit. Now, I would argue that, number one, they probably shouldn't do that, but at the same time, you know, it is a change. That was not what was bid on originally. So, you know, now is in one sense their opportunity to, you know, make those sort of changes. Any thoughts from you guys out in the Zoom gallery or in here in the room?
But the thing is, when you
Guaranteed maximum price.
Okay, there's a
I think they up it like 20%.
Well, I'm sorry, Hannah?
From what I know, contractors like to up whatever it is by 20% or more.
That is probably on the low end, but yeah. Okay, anybody else?
I do think
I
there's
have a comment I want to make because I want to clarify something that I said. We're all shifting what we call risk in
Sure.
construction.
Yes.
So what ends up happening is those 75, going back to the first example with the $75,000 a month payment. In that $75,000, the only cost that's really affecting the contractor every month is the cost that he absolutely positively has to pay every month,
Yes.
which is or even every week, which is your labor costs and your cost of insurance and so forth. So really in that 75,000, it may only represent maybe, let's say $15,000, $20,000 per month of cost that he absolutely has to pay every month.
Yep.
So the rest of that cost is material cost, in which they ship that risk over to the material suppliers, which have a unique way of doing accounting that's very favorable to manufacturers and suppliers. I worked on all three sides with the developer, contractor, and manufacturer. So it's a win-win situation, but like you said, at the end of the day, the banks win. And the last comment I want to make is that as developers, if we are smart, we stay away from design changes from architects, because the more design changes that appear on a job, you may have a contractor that loves change orders, but at the end of the day, it's actually going to cost the developer, if that project is delayed 30 days, then now he's carrying the interest carrying costs on that project an additional 30 days, so he ends up losing with more changes.
I agree. I totally agree. Good point. Great point. Okay, anybody else before we move on? Okay, let's move on to the next topic.
First question, it will be just about the future
Yeah.
value.
Okay, so the next topic, to a certain extent, is dealing with, kind of maybe once you have a project built, issues related to leasing the property as it relates to the quality of the tenants. And what I mean by tenant quality is more about, probably the easiest way to sort of think of it is more like their credit rating. Okay? Now, this can be true for residential tenants, but more specifically, what we're really trying to focus on are commercial tenants, whether they be office tenants, retail tenants, industrial tenants, whatever it might be. How do we try to account for or deal with differences in tenant quality, okay? And why does it matter? Well, one of the interesting things that I have seen, and I probably have seen a little bit more of, whether it's truly out there in the open or it's more sort of discussed behind closed doors on the lender side, is as it relates to tenant quality. So for example, let's say that we've got, whether it's a shopping center or it's an office building, and we've got two tenants, tenant A and tenant B. Tenant A, excellent credit, excellent history, long time in business, virtually recession-proof, hopefully maybe in this context, COVID-proof, and so it's a very, very, very strong tenant, okay, in terms of the quality of their credit and their background and operating history. Tenant B, not so much, okay? Tenant B, maybe it's a local tenant, maybe not been in business, maybe even a startup for that matter, okay? Potentially, sort of unknown as to how susceptible they're going to be to economic changes or downturns. They may not have a lot of cash reserves to be able to keep themselves afloat in the event of something like COVID happening. So very, and once again, one of the things that you have to understand about me, I love to use extreme examples because it illustrates the point, okay? And so if I am the lender and you're bringing me a project and these are the two tenants that have been selected for the project, and say, each of these tenants has 50,000 square feet each. And each of them potentially, maybe tenant A, I give a little bit of a break on the rent. Maybe they're going to pay $25 per square foot per year, whereas maybe tenant B, because they're sort of a lesser known tenant, are going to pay $30 per square foot per year. Now, as a lender, how do you think that I may look at this in terms of kind of a risk assessment? Thoughts?
Of a risk assessment, A is better for you.
The what, sorry?
The A is better because you have.
The A is better. Okay, so my question is, how much of an influence might that have in maybe what even interest rate that I charge you on the loan? Okay? I mean, think about it like this. Who is actually paying the mortgage?
Tenants.
Okay, you could say, yeah, it's the owner, but no. In reality, it's the tenants. Okay? And without those tenants, you know, maybe the owner might be able to afford the mortgage, maybe not. Okay? And so, to a large extent, if you're the lender on this deal, you're going to take a look at these, you know, two tenants with these two different leases, and you're going to say, absolutely, from the lender's perspective, I love tenant A, but I'm not a big fan of tenant B, and the question is, do I do anything about that as the lender, okay? Or, whenever I'm underwriting the deal, it's all kind of behind the scenes, and I don't really disclose the magic of what's happening behind the curtain, okay? Most lenders are going to try to evaluate the credit worthiness of those potential tenants, especially for this amount of space, this, you know, sort of dollar amount. And the question is, you know, what sort of risk adjustment might they make, you know, to basically account for this? And so the question is, you know, how might you make that adjustment? Well, you might say that for tenant A, we sort of say, all right, they have a relatively low risk, so we're going to use a discount rate of 5% for tenant A, but for tenant B, because we deem them to be a substantially higher risk, maybe we use a 9% discount rate. Okay? And then the question becomes, and assuming that both of these are, let's say, 5-year leases, what is, in essence, the present value, basically, of each of these leases?
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
We're getting this loan to buy this building, but we already know the tenants because they're already in there.
We're pre-leased. Would be one way to look at it.
I
So
just
you're, because
like, why do we know this?
okay, that's an excellent question. So every loan, every lender is a little bit different. Okay, what may happen, and it's going to make this little transition from the construction loan here for a hot second. All right, so you get the construction loan on a property, you go through, and ideally you finish the construction, you get the certificate of occupancy, you open up, you lease the property, it becomes occupied, you know, as soon as possible. Now, and whenever you do that, normally you transition from the construction loan into a permanent mortgage. Okay? Now what that means, or that process, what it's called, is you get from the permanent lender what is referred to as a takeout commitment. And what that basically means is that permanent lender is willing and able and committing to taking out the construction lender, paying them off, and then starting with a new traditional fixed mortgage on the property. Does that make sense? Okay, but this is kind of where your sort of point comes in. That permanent lender may make that takeout commitment contingent on certain things. And one of those things that is a typical sort of contingency is that the property be pre-leased or pre-leased up to a certain percentage. Okay? They may say it needs to be pre-leased up to 75% or something like that. So in our case, the lender is potentially saying you need to have 100% pre-leased because you only got two spaces, two 50,000 square foot spaces. So before I agree to take out the construction lender, you must have this property pre-leased. And in essence, I as the lender must pre-approve those leases.
Got it.
Okay? Now, and if that's the case, then as I said, they're going to be looking, from the underwriting perspective and saying, okay, who are these two tenants? And what are their backgrounds? And then what are their relative sort of risk? And so what we're doing now is then we're saying, okay, the lender, to a certain extent, is saying the cash flow from tenant A is going to be safer, more certain, more secure. The cash flow from tenant B is going to be less certain, less secure. Well, part of the way that you adjust for that as the owner of the property is you set maybe a higher lease rate for that lesser quality tenant.
Right.
But you also probably are going to adjust the value or the worth of those cash flows. So it's kind of like, in one sense, from the lender's perspective and from the developer's perspective, you're sort of saying, yeah, we're going to get more money from tenant B, but we're not so certain we're going to get all that money, so we're going to discount it that much more. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
To everybody out in Zoom land? Yes?
I was just wondering what the scenario was.
Yep. Okay. So, let's take a look then at how this sort of would work out. All right, so first of all, 50,000 square feet times $25 a year. $1,250,000. Okay, over here. 1.5. Yep. Okay, so right off the bat, without doing any sort of adjustments, most of us just instinctively are automatically going to say, as a developer, and even as a lender, instinctively with doing nothing else, we're saying, yeah, we're getting more money from tenant B, therefore we like tenant B more. But we also are saying, well, those cash flows may not be as certain, we're going to have to make some adjustments. Is that going to hold true after we make those adjustments? Okay, so what we're going to do in this case, let's say tenant A, just kind of split the screen here. Tenant A, all right, and clear everything out. So what's going to happen here is we're going to have that 1,250,000. That is going to be basically our payment that we are going to receive for 5 years, and we are going to discount by 5%. So we want to know what is the present value for that. Okay, and we're going to have the same process for tenant B. only it's going to be 1.5 million for 5 years. The difference is the discount rate of 9%, and we're going to see what the present value of that is. So do both of those real quick. Okay, so what do we sort of discover here? Which tenant would we prefer to have if we had to choose between the two? B. Okay, they are generating more money, and they're generating more than enough money, even with the higher discount rate that we're assigning to them, to have a higher present value for their loan. Now, once again, here's the thing that I want you to put in your head. We're doing these calculations, yes, these are calculations. And, you know, the input is ultimately what is going to determine the output. And so if you have, in essence, crappy inputs that are inaccurate, you know, unrealistic, so forth, so on, then, you know, that's not going to, you know, really give you an accurate answer. So we're making the assumption that, yeah, we're properly sort of evaluating these in the context of the relative risk associated with them. But just to kind of illustrate the point here, if we were to change the discount rate on tenant B to basically be the same as tenant A, you could kind of continue on, just put in the 5% interest rate and resolve. And this is the telltale. So the reality is, because we made the adjustment in the discount rate, we obviously deflated the value of tenant B's lease by what? About $600,000-$700,000 roughly. I mean, let's just try to.
Oh, that's if we use 5.
Yeah, 65 minus, let's say 58. So yeah, about $700,000 difference between the two. Okay, or between these two. Okay, and the reason for that roughly $700,000 difference is because of using 9%, which we thought and still do think that that is an appropriate discount rate for this property, for that particular tenant.
And the higher rent.
And the higher rent, but without that sort of risk adjustment, you can see they're generating roughly $1 million more in sort of present value rent than tenant A. Okay, so now, in a perfect world where all of these numbers are 100% accurate and realistic and so forth, what would you probably walk away with as a lesson? You'd probably say, I'd much prefer to have the whole building with tenant Bs. Simply because they are generating more money in that sense, okay? And sometimes that is true. Speaking as someone who owns and has owned a fair number of properties that I would consider Class C sort of properties, one of the reasons that I chose to compete within sort of that space, number one, wasn't as much competition. Number two, you typically, for the price that you pay relative to the income that you receive, it's a much higher rate of return. But The caveat being, there's also probably a higher level of risk of getting your money, in some cases, from those Class C tenants than might be the case with the Class A tenants. Okay, but assuming that you can get your money, from the Class C tenants, it might actually be a much better return overall to have those as tenants than the Class A. Okay? Thoughts, comments, observations from anybody?
It's a philosophy if you want to take the risk or not. I would never do that.
Okay. Okay, any other thoughts?
Dr. Porgy,
Yep.
well, let's say if you were looking to invest in purchasing a small retail space, and let's say it's 5 tenants, the space is capable of housing 5 tenants. The more A tenants that you get in that space is actually going to look a lot more favorable to a lender.
Absolutely it is.
Correct?
Absolutely, and that was the other side of my point, is because here's what I'm sort of suggesting. This is kind of, maybe to a certain extent, behind the scenes, the lender doing this sort of a calculation, and part of the reason they're doing this sort of a calculation is to get a sense for what is truly the income that you're going to be generating off of this property, adjusted for risk, and then using that to then basically say, all right, because you've got this extra risk for tenant B, we, as a lender, may charge you a substantially higher interest rate on the loan. Does that make sense? Okay? Now, as I said, a lot of this will be behind the scenes and you will never see it as the borrower. Okay? This is what potentially would go on, in a credit committee for the lender. They bring in a whole group of folks and they start, discussing, okay, the merits and issues surrounding this property and the quality of the tenants and that sort of thing, and saying, hey, well, given that they've got some lower quality tenants and so forth, we're going to have a little bit of a higher interest rate on the loan. Much the same way, which is much more transparent on you as an individual. All of you have a credit score, yes? Okay. How does that credit score get used by a lender? Well, for the most part, whenever you go to get a loan, whether it's a car loan, a home loan, a personal loan, whatever it might be, as a general rule, the lender is going to charge you a different interest rate based upon what that credit score is. Does that make sense? But in other words, if you have a lousy credit score, you're going to be charged probably a much, much higher interest rate. Matter of fact, a perfect example of this is like, somebody was showing me, like on, what was that site, CarMax, that, you go into CarMax, and one of the things on the financing options, it will actually say, okay, what is your credit score? And then you can see sort of in real time what adjustment would be made to your interest rate on the car loan, depending on what your credit score is. Okay, my point with all of that is that is the behind the scenes sorts of thing that the lender is looking at as it relates to sort of tenant quality. So what they are doing as a lender with these sort of commercial tenants is they're looking at Dun & Bradstreet reports and other things that they can obtain potentially about these tenants to determine how credit worthy they are, and then to what extent that is then going to influence how much they may potentially charge as an interest rate, and first of all, whether they're going to make a loan at all, okay? Because they may say, if you've got very low quality tenants, we don't want to touch that loan, because if the tenants are the ones that are really paying the bills, and those tenants are really sketchy, then why would you as a lender want to make the loan? Okay, make sense? Okay, all good in Zoom land. All right. Moving forward.
So what would the question be?
Calculation of the present value of the leases.
And would you ask, like, again, what will be the difference, like, if
Sure.
it was the same percentage?
Sure. Okay. Okay, this next one is an example of one that's going to be probably a little bit tricky. All right? And this is a form of a net present value sort of calculation. One of the things, as we tend to try to start refining the process of how we go about financing our projects and how we go about accounting for the revenue that we receive from those projects, up to this point, we have made the assumption that any sort of cash outflows or expenses that we have, whether they occur pretty much at time period 0 or at some point into the future, are just as risky or the same amount of risk as the cash inflows that we may receive at some point in the future. Okay, here's the part where it's sort of trying to explain this to where it makes as much sense as possible. Up to this point, in both the real estate finance course and in this course, with the exception of what we just did earlier about the construction loan, about being all cash outflows, okay? We have, for the most part, focused on you buy a property at time period 0, you spend money on it, and then subsequent months are revenue that you are generating from that property, or subsequent years are revenue that you're generating from that property. Correct? Yes, bob our heads up and down. That's what we've done. Okay. Now, where this begins to be different is we begin to say, all right, well, what if we basically are doing kind of a mixed or hybrid sort of analysis of where we're sort of trying to take in whole or in tandem and batch all of our outgoing expenses together and then batch sort of all of our revenues together. Okay, so let me try to explain what I'm talking about. I'm just trying to set up the conceptual aspect of this. Okay, so let's say we got 6 months. And then during this 6 months, we are going to be spending money, and let's just say we are going to spend $100,000 here, maybe for the first 3 months, we're spending $100,000. And we could say this is tenant finish out. This is maybe some form of construction or whatever it might be, but it's a cash outflow from our perspective. It's not one lump sum at one period of time. It's spread out over, let's say, the next 3 months. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay? Now, subsequent to that, we maybe are receiving cash inflows of, let's say, $120,000. Now, one model that this would, in a very broad way would be sort of reflective of is like, let's say, home building. Okay? So, in essence, you could say, all right, we built a home for $100,000, but yet we actually are not going to get paid until a couple of months later, in month 4, we're going to get paid $120,000 for that $100,000 house that we built up here. Does that make sense? This is just one way to think about it. Okay? The next month, we've built this house for 100,000. We sell it a few months later for 120. We build this one for 100,000. We sell it obviously a couple months later for 100,000. So, but we're sort of trying to, instead of segmenting these out into individual sort of matching sorts of analyses, we're sort of saying, okay, we're going to build 3 houses and we're going to sell 3 houses, all kind of in one fell swoop, but it's going to be over time. Or you can also just sort of look at this as kind of how I originally set it up. This is one property, and it just so happens that, yeah, we've got all of these expenses in terms of finish out, and then ultimately, after that, we're going to be receiving rental income or some other form of income, whether it's off of the sale of the property or off of leasing the property. Okay, does everybody understand? This is, once again, meant to be a fairly simple setup to try to explain a fairly complex problem. Okay, let's just start with the basics. 120,000 times 3, just to make sure that we don't screw it up, 120,000 times 3, 360,000 of income. Whereas 100,000 times 3 would be 300,000 in sort of expenses. So putting it very mildly or succinctly, 300,000 subtracted from 360,000 leaves us with basically, if we want to sort of break it down in very basic terms, $60,000 profit, okay? With no time value of money adjustments, okay? Is everybody cool with that? Yes or no? Okay? Now, this is the part that I said was going to be a little bit more challenging, okay? And that is kind of how do we sort of deal with specifically making adjustments on these two. Well, now, ordinarily you say, oh, that's super easy, Professor Berge, I know exactly what we need to do. We need to go in and we need to do cash flows. So we take 1 payment per year, and then we put in, let's say, 0 as our initial cash flow, since there's nothing happening there. Then we put in the 100,000 as a cash flow, and we say that occurs 3 times, so 3 shift n sub j, and then the next 120,000, and actually I need to put the, since I'm doing that that way, plus minus signs, okay? So 120,000 is going to be plus, actually not minus. Oops. Yeah, I'm wrong here. Okay, there's going to be a cash flow, positive cash flow for 3 months. And then, you know, might apply some sort of a discount rate. I don't know. You can sort of say 5%. And then solve for net present value. Okay, let's do that, but this is not what we're going to do.
Oh, so we're not doing this?
You're going to do it, but this is not what the problem is going to ask for.
We have to do this step.
This is just to illustrate what you would ordinarily have done.
So we need to do this step though in the math?
No,
No.
Oh.
but you need to know it.
No, I know, I'm just saying. It's like all so much, it's like I'd rather just like keep focusing on what I actually did. I hate the calculator.
Okay. So what I end up with is $9,968.48. Okay, is that what you guys get?
Yeah.
okay? Now, let's just say that we did a 0% interest rate here for a second. We get 60,000, okay? So, a couple of things going on here. One is your calculator, and Excel is the same, so this is not like something unique to the calculator. Does Excel and your calculator does not like a mixing of inflows and outflows beyond time period 0. Okay, this is the reason for this whole problem. So in other words, this number here is wrong because the calculator is doing some funky math as it relates to these cash outflows. It's having those mixed cash flows kind of screws everything up, is what I'm trying to articulate here. And and the same sort of thing would be true if you tried to solve for internal rate of return, okay? But we put in 0 as the discount rate. That basically is just saying, okay, all we're doing is kind of what we did up here, which was solve for what is the actual, profit, all right? Now, so what can we do to fix the problem, okay? And to get the type of answer that we're really searching for that's meaningful to us, okay? So, okay, first of all, lesson number 1 on this. If you have cash outflows, in other words, negative numbers, occurring in your cash flow stream other than in time period 0, or you can have them like in a construction loan like we had earlier where it's all cash outflows, you need to make some adjustments, okay? So that's kind of the first lesson, all right? Now, there's another issue here as well that we need to deal with. Let's kind of go back up here for a second. Let's take a look. Those 3 outflows. Where's that money coming from? From the bank, from our back pocket, and for the most part, those expenditures are fairly predictable, theoretically. Yes? In other words, we know what we're going to have to spend. Okay? Now, of course, we can make all kinds of arguments that, all right, yeah, we're going to have uncertain construction costs and so forth, but assuming that we can lock in whatever those costs are, the construction costs, that should be a fairly low-risk expenditure. Yes? In other words, low risk meaning it's very certain as to what those dollar amounts are going to be. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? So, as a result of those being pretty much all but certain, the risk on these being different than this, risk low. Okay? Whereas over here, these are revenues. Revenues, as a general rule, are not as certain because they're dependent maybe on a lot of additional outside factors. For example, you have tenants that may not pay their rent, is a big one, okay? You may have challenges of keeping the property leased or getting it leased to begin with. Or, if it's in a sales sort of environment, it may take you longer to sell a property, or you may have to sell it at a deep discount in order to actually sell it. Does everybody understand that? So in other words, the revenues, as a general rule, are going to be higher risk. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Bob heads up and down, okay? Now, So what that means is that we're probably going to want to assign, instead of saying for both of these, we're going to assign basically a 5% discount rate, we're probably going to say, all right, these are so certain, we might give the expenses a 2% discount rate, and the revenues, we might give, I don't know, an 8% discount rate. All right? Because they're a higher risk. Okay, does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay, that's the easy part. Okay, now, the more complicated part is how do we do that? All right? We basically have to sort of treat them as two separate problems. All right, so let's start with the expenses first. In this particular instance, what we would do, we've got one payment per year. And we're going to put in our 2% discount rate. We're going to put in the $100,000 as a negative payment occurring for 3 years. And we're going to solve for present value. Okay, so let's start with that. Okay, so that represents the present value of expenses. Okay, everybody cool with that? Okay. Now, this next piece gets a little trickier. Okay, let's kind of clear everything out. And for it, we said it's going to be an 8% interest rate. So we once again kind of clear everything out. 8% interest rate. And we're going to be receiving, whoops, not 150, 120, 120,000 as a payment, and we're going to receive that for 3 times, or 3 months. And then we're going to solve for present value. But here's the thing, we're not going to be done with that. And hopefully, those of you that are out there in Zoom and also here, you're going to understand why we're not going to be done with it. All right, so let's just put it in first. And what we get is 309,251,64. Okay, so let's explain why we are not done with it. Okay, so what we have done, just to kind of illustrate the point, is we've gotten the present value of the expenses, and we have said those are 288, 388. So basically here at time period 0, if we're looking at it from a positive side, 288, what was it? 388. Okay, and that puts the value right here at time 0. Okay, everybody agree with that? Yes? Okay, that's not the hard part, or that's not the complicated part. Now, when we have discounted the revenues, think about what we've done. We've basically said those revenues are occurring 3 times, but whenever we discount them back, the way that we have just done it is we're actually getting the present value as of right here. And the reason for that is because it's just compounding back 1, 2, 3. Does everybody follow that? In other words, what we need to do is we have to make the adjustment now to bring back that value from there back to here to to be able to compare apples to apples. So what we have to, in actuality, do is we have to kind of go back down here and we say, okay, let's clear everything here for a second. And we're going to put the 309, 251, 64 as our future value. We're going to put in 3 as our term because it needs to go back 3 more periods. This is sort of additional. Now it just happens to be the same as the original. This is in addition. This is to get it back to time period 0. And we have to put in our 8% discount rate, then solve for present value. Okay? So let's do that. And we end up with 245, 493, 92. So, to recap, we have the present value of our expenses being 288. Whoops, hold on a second. Dang it. Okay. Well, okay, we did say, okay. Did we say this? Okay, this is annual, not monthly. Okay, just making sure. Because, well, this is annual in the sense that each one of these represents a year. Okay, because we did 1 payment per year. Okay, so 288, 388, 33 is the present value of our expenses. The present value of our revenues, in this case, is 245, 493.
No, that's the final. I thought it was 309, 250.
No. This is the adjusted.
Oh.
This is what I'm saying. So, in other words, this is the revenue that we're receiving. These are the expenses that we've had. So, in other words, we've actually got a loss. Okay? I probably should have just, so it makes more sense, let's just do this. Let's put the expenses down here.
That revenue is 92 cents. By the way.
Okay, so 288, 388, 33, and we'll get rid of this one up here so it doesn't confuse you. Okay, so if that's our revenues, that's our expenses, then we actually have a loss on this. So a loss of $39,894.41. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay. Now, a couple of little things to just sort of point out. I will tell you that on the quiz, it's not going to be a loss. Okay? It's actually going to be a positive revenue. The other thing to point out, let me just double check on the quiz because I'm not purposely trying to throw you for a loop. Okay? On the quiz, the only real difference, other than the numbers, is it's going to be monthly. Okay? So the only thing you're going to have to change is obviously the number of compounding periods per year from 1 to 12. Okay? Now, the reason why that this is, as I said, a little bit tricky is because the step that most people forget to do is the sort of last step to adjust, because what's actually happening is we've got to adjust that 309, whatever it was, 309, $251, we've got to adjust that back to time period 0, and that's where we get the whatever it was, 240,
493.
245, 493.
So the only thing on the quiz that's gonna be different is in the expenses. The first thing we do is a 12 and not a 1.
Right.
Okay.
Not in the expenses,
not-
also
well,
in
both.
in both.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Okay. Now, does the one thing, I'm surprised I'm not getting the questions on this, but does everybody understand why we had to do that extra step in the sense of we've got to bring those cash flows of the 120,000 for those last 3 months, we've got to bring that all the way back to time period 0. And so that is the reason for that sort of second calculation of the additional, in this case, 3 years, to bring that back to time period 0. But what my point being is if you don't do that, and in this problem, if you hadn't have done that, you would have thought, oh, this is wonderful. Okay, I've got $288,000 of expenses, and my revenues are $309,000. Woo, I'm making a profit. But the reality is you're not making a profit because you're having to wait basically an additional 3 years to get that money. Therefore, it's worth less to you. So in terms, from a time value of money perspective, you're losing money. Okay, make sense? Questions?
We need to have the entire period, but because we're doing, can't just leave it at 3 years, we have the entire 6 years.
Okay, Dominic, you speak up just a little bit. I didn't quite hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yep, now I can.
And I was the same, you just need it for the entire, you need it for the entire 6 years. You can't just do it for 3 years, obviously, right?
Well,
That's the whole-
you've got to discount it back because, in other words, you're not receiving the 120,000 for all 6 years. You're only receiving it starting in year 4, 5, and 6. But you've got to discount it back to time period 3, which is sort of 0, and then you've got to discount it back again to the original time period 0. Is what we're saying.
Gotcha, okay.
All right. All right.
Mr. Forget, I have a question. Well, where did the 39,894 come from?
That's just subtracting the present value of the revenues, or subtracting the present value of the expenses from the present value of the revenues. So in other words, you have a loss. If you look at this from our purposes, this is in essence your loss.
So why shouldn't that number be 42,894?
Well, did I miscalculate? Maybe I did. Hold on. Yep, you're right. I don't know how I screwed that up, but I did. 42,895 would be the difference, or the loss. Okay? Did I write everything down right? Yep, okay. Okay, all right, moving forward. Okay, these next two, you can relax, they're both easy.
Thank you.
Oops. Okay. So, for those of you that, once again, were in the finance class, you're already obviously familiar with cap rates and that sort of thing. Those of you that are obviously coming into this class, maybe not as much, okay? So, first things first, the cap rate, I'm gonna scroll up, I'll come back. Cap rate is very simple. You have probably heard of it if you've even tangentially been involved in real estate, and it boils down to the simple little formula I refer to as ERV. And ERV is basically your income, in this case, annual net operating income divided by a rate of return or a cap rate gives us the value on a property, okay? Now, whenever you buy a property, you typically are going to have what is referred to as a going-in cap rate, okay? And what that would mean is, all right, I bought the property for, let's say, $1 million, that's the value, and the property had annual net operating income of, let's say, $120,000. All right? So to get the cap rate, we're simply going to take the income divided by the value. So 120,000 divided by 1 million would give us a cap rate of 12%. Okay? So 120,000, you basically, or just simply, the way I always learned it and the way I typically teach it is whatever it is that you're solving for, you're putting your hand over what you're solving for and then just follow the steps. So in this case, 120 divided by 1 million gives us our cap rate. If we were solving for the value, we'd simply take 120 divided by 12%. That would give us our value. If we want to find the income, it would simply be the cap rate times the value. Okay? Now, so assume that this is the case that we bought the property for $1 million. It's generating $120,000 of income, or that's expectations can be generated at pretty much right off the bat. And that gives us this cap rate or going in cap rate, let's say, of 12%. All right? Now, you can also sort of look at this going in cap rate as even, if you don't want to look at it like, for example, if it's a property that's under construction and that sort of thing, then you would typically look at, okay, once it's available for occupancy, once it's been built and so forth, and opens its doors, and you're stabilized, net operating income after the first, let's say, year or whatever it might be, that is also going to be sort of your going in cap rate. Okay, everybody cool with that? Now, the going out cap rate, or the terminal value cap rate, that's when you sell the property. And what the cap rate is there is going to be predicated on typically what the next year's worth of income is predicted to be. So, if you have a 5-year holding period, based on what I just said, what year of income are you going to use for the going out cap rate? And I know Alex wants to answer the question because he's all smiles.
I want to say it's the cash flows predicted for year 6.
Yes. Okay. Excellent. Based on what I just said, which was that you are going to be looking at the cash flows for the subsequent year after you dispose of the assets. So that means use year 6. Use year 6 NOI for calculation. Okay, so now we come back down here to our good friend Irv. So this is our going in over here. This is our out. Okay. So, in this particular instance, what we're going to say is, all right, maybe after 5 years, our income is now, let's say it's grown to be $150,000 a year.
And you would obviously give us this data, like the
Yeah. Okay. And the going out cap rate, and this is an extremely important lesson before I write a number in there. Okay. If you owned this property, if you were the owner of this property over that 5-year period, what do you want in terms of the cap rate?
Lowest cap rate possible.
Go down.
Yes. Okay, everybody here though. In the terminal cap rate, in a perfect scenario, you want this cap rate to be as low as possible. And the reason you want it to be as low as possible is because you want to get the highest sale price that you can possibly get. Well, you, to a certain extent, don't really determine the cap rate inherently as the seller. But you do in one sense that if you have maintained the property very well, and you have very high quality tenants, and the market looks very stable for the foreseeable future, all of those very positive things that you have some control over will influence that cap rate. So if by doing that, you can go from having a 12% cap rate to maybe, I don't know, a 9% cap rate, okay, then that's going to have a positive influence on what you're going to sell the property for. Now, let's also step back here for a second before we do the calculation. It is an awesome, wonderful, terrific, marvelous thing to have your cap rate go from 12% down to 9%, because that is basically saying this property is less risky than what it was whenever I bought it. It's more desirable than whenever I bought it. It has super high quality tenants from when I bought it. All of those are wonderful, okay? And let's not overlook, in addition to lowering the cap rate, we are also increasing the income, meaning we're getting higher rents for the property. So we have a super double whammy, awesome, terrific, marvelous thing that is going to positively influence the value of the property going out. So let's look. 150,000 divided by 9%. Now the property, supposedly, we should be able to sell it for about 1.6 million. $600,000 increase, okay? Part of that increase is directly attributable to the increase in rent. Part of it is attributable to the lowering of risk and the quality of the asset. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Yes or no? Bob or heads? I love to see the heads bobbing. Okay.
How did you evaluate this 0.9, the 9%? That's what the less expenses that you have now? Or?
No, it's based upon what the market is willing to pay for that quality of an asset. In other words, you have potentially repositioned the asset maybe from a Class B property to a Class A property, okay? And they're willing to accept a lower sort of rate of return. A purchaser is willing to accept a lower rate of return. You're walking away with a small mountain of money because you have adjusted the quality of the asset. Now keep in mind, this could go the other direction.
Could you get higher?
It could go the other direction where you buy an asset that's performing quite well, you do a horrible job of property management. So let's take that scenario here for a hot second. So instead of this, what might happen on the negative side? What would happen? Let's say your revenue goes from 120,000 to maybe 100,000. Whoops. And your cap rate, instead of 12%, maybe is now 15%. Now your value has gone down to, it just so happens, it's obviously $1 million less, but 666,666.67. So in other words, in one sense, you have potentially, you could have had $1 million more on the property when you sold it.
Why is
If
the
you-
numbers different?
Because of the percentage.
No,
No, not the 15. Why is the annual NOI different? I thought
we said that we lowered
Oh, you
our
lowered
revenue
that
as well.
too? Oh, okay. Sorry.
We did the double whammy of lowering both the revenue as well as raising the cap rate. And so in doing that, we destroyed basically $1 million of value between basically what we could have sold it for and what we sold it for, because we did a poor job of property management and maintaining it and repositioning it. Okay, so it works both ways, is my point. But what we prefer clearly is the top, which is where we are able to obviously derive a much higher selling price for the property. Okay, all right. Any questions? Okay, so that knocked out 2 questions right there. Okay, going in cap rate, going out cap rate. All right.
I like those ones.
What's the question from going in or out?
I think you know.
What is the going in cap
Is it
rate?
just the
and what is
value
the
of the
go-
property or?
Yep. As I said, these are the easy questions. These are the ones that just pretty much multiply or divide. Okay? Okay. Now, this next one is also easy. Once again, all of this is in your book. So in the event that you want to go back and you want to kind of reference, some things, we can do that, or you can do that. Okay, so one of the things that your book goes over, which I think it makes sense, and it's a good little calculation, it's called the gross development profit margin. And what this calculation does is it takes into account what we just looked at with respect to a going in cap rate and a going out cap rate, and just on the difference between the cap rates, what does that mean that we have managed to sort of accomplish during the time that we held the property, or that we took the property from being developed through ultimately selling the property, okay? That's the reason why they kind of refer to it as the gross development profit margin. It's kind of like, okay, you acquired the property, it was sort of in this situation, and over your ownership and development and redevelopment and whatever else that you did, transitioning it in a positive way to get it to sell at a lower cap rate, what does that represent in terms of a percentage difference in sort of value, okay? Just isolating that one variable. So, basically what you're going to do is you're going to take the going in, the going in cap rate divided by the going out cap rate and then once you've calculated that, then you're going to subtract out 1. Okay, and that is going to give you the gross development profit margin. Okay, so let's take the example that we just did. All right, our going in cap rate was 12%. our going out cap rate initially was 9%. Okay, so let's just and so if you just do that, you get 1.33. But as you said, the remaining part of the formula is to subtract out 1, or we get basically 0.33, or 33%. Okay? So what that's actually saying, another way to look at it, because of that much difference between the cap. Now, in practice and you know, the difference between the going in and going out is probably not going to be that wide, okay? It may be 0.5% or maybe 1%, depending on the circumstances. But in this case, I kind of exaggerated a little bit. Difference between 12% and 9%, it might be more like going from 12% to 11.5% or something like that. But anyway, in any event, what this is saying is that change in cap rate going from 12% going in to going out of 9%, that basically represents a 33% increase in value because of that adjustment. Okay, does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay, so my point being is the more you can adjust your cap rate downward in the event of a sale, the more money that in essence you can derive off of the sale of property, but also, in other words, another way to sort of look at it is the lower your cap rate, the more every dollar of income is really worth, is the best way to sort of think of it. Because you're discounting it less. With a low cap rate, there's a low discount rate, okay? Meaning that dollar of income is worth that much more, okay? So in a perfect scenario, you want as low of a cap rate as you can possibly get, and then based upon that really low cap rate, you ultimately, hopefully can have a much higher value. But in this case, you end up with, just because of lowering the cap rate, whether it's in your control or out of your control or whatever the circumstances may be, that represents a 33% basically profit margin just on that alone. Does that make sense? Keeping your income constant, okay, if you wanted to. Okay? Questions?
I just have a question again with these cap rates. And so when you get an investment and somebody gives you all these numbers and says, okay, this is the cap rate or thing, how do you know that this cap rate that they give you is the market value?
Okay, good question. So the question is, in essence, okay, you go to maybe buy something, and they're telling, and the seller is telling you, okay, the cap rate is this on this property, and how do you know that that's a valid cap rate? Excellent question. The difficult part of that is, yeah, the seller has their perspective on what that cap rate is and what that cap rate should be. You may have a different perspective. And your perspective might be the cap rate should be higher. Okay, meaning you're going to pay less for the property if you're the purchaser. And so there may be a fair amount of arguing and negotiation and explaining and so forth, so on that takes place. And both of you potentially are going to have to come to either a consensus or make your case with evidence one way or the other. So on the seller side, the seller would want to probably take a look at, okay, identify several other properties that are similar that have sold within recent history and what cap rate they sold at, okay? You, as the purchaser, would also want to verify that those are reasonable, you know, comparables, and they're, you know, that there's no funny business going on, that you probably go and do your own sort of comparable search, and, you know, hopefully the two of you kind of eventually, you know, reach sort of that middle ground of, okay, here's what we think is an appropriate cap rate and selling price for the asset. And in the more sophisticated urban sort of markets, there's a lot of transactions that have taken place, and so that process is relatively straightforward. As you migrate into tertiary or kind of periphery sort of markets, not so much. Thus is one of the reasons that I have said those are the markets that I personally prefer to play in, are those periphery, tertiary markets, because there's not a gazillion people chasing the same deal. And hopefully I have maybe a better understanding or have a little bit more of a competitive edge than I would have if I'm in this market where there's a ton of free flow of information. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Any questions?
Dr. Forey, one of the things I want to say is that on a cap rate, it's really left up to the market, because it seems like one of the dangers is that if you do a performer and you base it on a very low cap rate in order to justify a higher sale price, you can actually get in trouble with that, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's what I'm saying. You need to be realistic about it. I'm not saying, deflated, inflated. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that in a more sophisticated market, like, let's say, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, that sort of thing, you've got a gazillion people all looking at the same deals, all looking at the same sales, all looking at pretty much all of this information that's easily accessible and available. And so for the most part, whenever people come to the closing table of trying to sort of say, what is the value of this and how much should I pay you for it and so forth, it's probably going to be a fairly straightforward, fairly, maybe more agreeable process if they can agree on the fundamentals, okay? As opposed to, what I was suggesting is, if you're not in a sophisticated market, that you are one of only a half a dozen players, in some sort of tertiary market, and hopefully there you may have better market knowledge than the average participant. It's a less efficient market, therefore there's more opportunity potentially for a situation of where you as the buyer may be able to get a better price for something because you have an uninformed seller. Or you have, as a seller, you have more information than maybe an uninformed buyer. Does that make sense? Whereas in a market like Miami, you're probably dealing with really informed sellers, really informed buyers, and therefore the information flow is pretty efficient. Now, every so often, yeah, you're going to have people that are not informed buyers or not informed sellers, and what's going to happen in a market like Miami? If you have an uninformed seller, what are they going to do? They're probably going to sell the property too cheap, okay? But there are probably very few of those people out there, except in weird circumstances. On the buyer side, the uninformed buyer, what are they probably going to do? Pay too much for a property, okay? Because they don't know what they're doing. They're not realizing, where the market is and what's really happening. Because the moment a deal in like Miami, basically Tri-County area, pops up on the market in some way or another, whether it's through the MLS or through LoopNet or wherever, there's probably 1,000+ people looking at that deal, okay? And you would expect that within that 1,000+ people looking at that deal, many of those people are really sophisticated and know exactly what they're doing, and the ones that see value are instantly going to jump on it and buy it. The others that maybe take a little bit more time are probably not going to have the opportunity to even buy it, because it's going to be gone if it's a really good deal. And if it's not a good deal, it's going to sit on the market forever. Okay?
So we can also factor in the motivation of the seller as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's you know, a whole other aspect of the psychology of basically the buyers and the sellers, but, you know, on the seller side, there may be all kinds of weird motivations, and weird or unusual motivations. You know, you could have a situation where somebody has died, and they have an estate, and their family is trying to dispose of the assets, and they just want a quick, easy, painless, you know, sale. Don't really want to negotiate, just want to, here's the price, done, you know, and be over with it, okay? But then you also, you know, may have somebody going through a divorce, same sort of situation. You know, maybe does somebody want to, you know, dispose of the assets? You may have somebody going through a lawsuit. You may have somebody, you know, I mean, there's a lot of different motivations, you know, on the part of the seller as well as on the buyer for that matter. And, you know, some are you know, going to drive them to maybe do less rational things than maybe they ordinarily would, or less informed things than they ordinarily would. Okay, moving forward. All right, let's go ahead and take a quick break. It's 9:55, so 5-minute break. We've just finished up question 6, so 7, 8, 9, and 10. So we're a little over halfway there. And these last ones won't take as long. So take about a 5-minute break. We'll see you back at about 10 o'clock, roughly. Small group.
I'm having like calculator problems. I don't really know why for the first one, and the second one I'm gonna ask you after. I swear I do exactly what you write on the board, the steps on the calculator, and I get a 0. I must be hitting something wrong. you doing anything for Halloween?
Oh, you never know.
Big party?
One never knows.
Are you dressing up?
I don't know.
Oh, come on. Are all the other classes on Saturdays also?
Yes.
For next semester?
Yes,
So there's nothing during the week?
absolutely not. We tried evening classes a while back. For 31 years, I have done a mixture of Saturdays and evenings for graduate courses, and I will tell you, hands down, without question, Saturday classes are so much better.
Really? Why do you
Because
think?
people are awake.
More people are awake. Because then people come at 6 o'clock and it's like, oh, I have to sit here now and listen to you, and I just dealt with a 10-hour day.
Exactly.
So, cause like next semester, so I'm taking three at a time. Cause like one is long, like the whole
Correct.
thing. So there'll be 2 classes on Saturday during the day,
Mhm.
and then one
During the base will be fully online.
fully online. I just didn't know how it was gonna work.
Yep.
I'm doing the software Argus one online right now, so
Oh, yeah.
it's a little challenging online.
All classes next semester are gonna be the same thing, right? Online?
What, Dominic, what'd you say?
All classes online are gonna be online next semester, right?
Ju-
It's the same.
Well, I mean, the only class that is fully online next semester is the financial modeling course. All the other classes will be just like this, be the mixed hybrid thing.
So I missed the first part. Which class? It's not, it's
5895 financial modeling.
that one you have to be present in
No,
class?
no, just the opposite. The financial modeling class, 5895, is 100% fully online, period.
Oh, I got you.
All of the other classes are just like this one, kind of a mix of, if you choose to show up, you can. If you choose to be online, you can. But yeah.
Has there been a timeline decided yet on when Blendflex is going to end?
My suspicion is never.
It's the new normal.
Yeah, for the time being, I mean, you know,
So
look,
could it still happen next year?
I don't know. I mean,
It's
you know,
not giving more access to more people?
I mean-
Access to more people?
you know, well, yeah, I mean, look, from my perspective, I'm happy with this. I'm happy. I wish I could get rid of the mask, and I'm sure all of you do too. I mean,
You can, we don't mind.
but what I'm saying is, you know, that's really the only downside for me, is
We
just,
still have class after
you know, as an
Thanksgiving.
old man, you know, I get short of
Last
breath.
Saturday? Do we have class online that Saturday after Thanksgiving?
Absolutely, we do.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll be in.
Because it's only 8-week class.
So I'll be up at 3 a.m. in Los Angeles?
Wherever you are.
Yay.
You can look it afterwards on the.
No, it should be 5 a.m.
No, but you can look
No,
it
it's
on
a 3-hour
YouTube.
difference.
Okay.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
5
it's
a.m.
You can look it on YouTube.
Yeah. I guess it's 6.
Okay. So another kind of thing we want to sort of explore is, in general, buy or develop. In a very basic way. Kind of illustrate, once again, yet another sort of concept. So one of the decisions that you may have at your disposal, obviously as an investor and or developer, is, does it make sense for me to go out and go through all the brain damage associated with building a property from the ground up versus saying, let somebody else deal with that whole development process stuff. I want to simply be an investor and not suffer as much brain damage and buy an existing property with an existing cash flow. And so this is where, now obviously you're in a program that's really focused on development. So most of you have, for the most part, acknowledged that you're interested in suffering the brain damage that goes along with being a developer, okay? And going through all the risk and all of the potential return and everything else that kind of, you know, goes along with that approach to the process. But sometimes we have to sort of step back and kind of say, is one approach better than another, okay? So, and this is not a complex problem. This is a simple problem, very simple solution, but what it's meant to do is to make you think a little bit more about buying something versus building something, okay? And just kind of, you know, a couple of things to sort of put in the back of your mind. So let's say that under the buy category, we could find a building that's $5 million for purchase. And so that's the price of the building with the land. You know, that's everything. You know, we're buying it basically ready to stick our key in the front door of the building and open it up for business, okay? On the development side, we can buy the land, go through all the brain damage of the construction process and get everything up and ready for occupancy. And let's say that our whole out-of-pocket cost are $4 million. $4 million less. Okay? I'm sorry. That's once again, lack of air to the brain by virtue of the mask is, yeah, making me a little loopy. Okay, $1 million difference between developing versus buying. And so the simple thing that we're sort of talking about here is on the buy side, yet again, we're just simply saying that's an all-inclusive, open the front door, it's a done deal. Whereas on the development side, we've got to factor in a lot of those other issues and non-monetary concerns, okay? But on a very basic level, it's going to cost us less money. So basically, we're going to have to pay $1 million more to avoid the brain damage, okay? Simple way to sort of think about it, okay? Now, but we've also got another way to kind of, that we probably need to think about this, that with this one, sort of our cap rate, let's say is 4%, sort of going into this deal. Whereas over here, once we get everything built and we potentially get it open for occupancy, maybe the cap rate here is, let's say, 6%. Okay, because higher risk of getting through all of that brain damage and then ultimately getting it open for occupancy and that sort of thing. Okay, does everybody understand what we're sort of saying? Okay. Now, then the question would be, if we sort of apply that, once again, our basic little IRV model to both of these, what are we being given? We're being given our cap rate, this first instance of 4%, with our value of $5 million. So then our basically implied income would be 5 million times 4%, or 200,000. So implied NOI would be 200,000. Over here, for this one, 6% cap rate and the value of 4 million. That would mean an implied cap rate of 240,000. Or I'm sorry, implied NOI. Okay, now let's say that here are our sort of our baseline sort of assumptions. So just based upon kind of what we've got going on here, what are your thoughts as to what we should do or not do?
There's a time value also in there.
Okay.
Like when you had this $4 million that are like blocked for a while, so you...
Okay, you may have to wait a little while to get the money, or start getting the money, the NOI, because you've got the development process you've got to get through. But let's assume it's a relatively short development process, not an overly complex building, maybe something like an industrial building, okay? That, pretty much just a big barn for all intents and purposes, okay?
Develop, for sure, because you're buying in at a lower cap rate.
Right. And so the idea is that, over here, we love the whole thing of the, basically,
And it's ready.
yeah, and it's ready, but we're also paying more for it, more for the income because the cap rate's lower. Okay, on the development side, we're going to pay less for the property, we're going to incur the brain damage, but we're going to get a higher NOI on the property once it's up and running. And this is one of the pieces that I think is the valuable piece to this, is what, based on what we talked about earlier today, what do we hope to be able to do over time?
Increase value.
To increase the value with the development piece, so that over time, we might be able to lower that cap rate and then still keep our income, but yet that might, impact the value significantly. So
Because isn't that higher cap rate helping us in the sense?
it is, and yes, it's part of, but it's also sort of assuming that we've got a lot more risk. So let's say that we were able to lower it over time to be 4%, keeping our income constant, then that means over time, and it may not be a very long period of time, we might be able to ultimately sell the property for $6 million. Okay? Whereas the property for purchase has kind of, probably the best way to sort of think of it, it's kind of maxed out its value. Okay? Whereas for the developed property, what we're hoping is that we are bringing some special sauce, into the mix on developing this, taking on the extra risk of going through the brain damage, and that hopefully at the end of the day, we get the project done, we get it leased, but also we are able to enhance the value and hopefully lower the cap rate, and then walk away maybe a few years later selling it for $6 million to just some sort of an investor. Okay? Does that make sense? So my point with this is kind of hopefully illustrates a couple of different things in your mind, that if you just want to be an investor, that's fine, nothing wrong with that. But realize that just as an investor, in many instances, if you're just buying something that's already fully ready and it's already being run reasonably well, there's usually not going to be a lot of upside potential in terms of value creation. Does that make sense? Whereas on the development side, if you're building something brand new from scratch and you're able to create hopefully something special, but also over time you're able to reduce the risk associated with it by virtue of getting high quality tenants, keeping it well maintained, and yada, 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 then you hopefully, through that enhanced value creation, can create a less risky asset and then potentially sell it off to someone else and turn a nice little tidy profit above and beyond what you paid for it to develop. Make sense? Okay, any questions?
Dr. Forty, a real life example, when I was working with this developer up in Boca, he actually did something like this where he developed a property out of the ground, but when he purchased the land, at the time that he purchased the land, the cap rates were very high, and so I guess he got the property pretty cheap. So he ended up developing this particular property. Construction costs and everything all in, I think was about $90 million. By the time we got done with the project, the cap rates had fallen. I guess you call them constricting, I don't know. And he ended up being in a situation where he could sell the property for $160 million.
Yep.
Just in a period of 3 years.
Yep. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Now, once again, some of that's luck, some of it's market timing,
Yeah.
some of it, is force. I mean, there are a lot of different things at play there. And this is, this is why I sort of keep saying, and once again, I'm not saying that I'm absolutely right about this, but I think most of us, if we're being honest, we would agree that we're pretty much at the top of the market right now. In terms of what the price points are for virtually everything. And we're probably maybe even a little bit over the top of the market with respect to prices are beginning to kind of come down a little bit in a lot of the different markets. Not just talking about residential, I'm talking about pretty much all the markets. Certainly the ones that have been hit hard by COVID, I mean, you've got property owners that are just like, I've got to sell this because I can't afford to keep it because I don't have any tenants, or my tenants aren't paying the rent. So my point is, if we're being honest about that, then we have to sort of say, okay, it's transitioning from the seller's market into the buyer's market, but yet, as a buyer, it's probably not the best time yet, because it really, usually whenever you have market swings, it is invariable that, you have the whole thing of everything kind of goes, whoop, up to a certain point, and then a lot of times it usually kind of becomes a rocky sort of, maybe not a free fall, but it certainly, has a downward effect that as it's happening, it's just kind of like all this chaos of what's really happening, and is the time now, has it really bottomed out, and so forth, so on. And being able to sort of time or get close to timing when that bottoming out takes place is obviously that's where the real opportunities are to be able to kind of swoop in, and if you've got the cash or the resources to be able to lock something up, but the problem is sometimes being able to know when that's happening in real time to be able to take advantage of it. Because also you have a compounding issue is usually whenever that has happened, lenders don't want to lend because they're scared to death. And so it's like, unless you've got a pocket of cash or you've got private equity that you can potentially come in and buy the stuff and then have the ability to hold on to it for a couple of years until the market stabilizes, it can be real challenges. Anyway, okay, moving forward.
So
All right.
you're just looking
looking for the implied NOI.
Yeah, that's pretty easy.
We're done with that?
Okay. All right, so let's say that we've got some land. All right, and here are the variables that we've got. We've got the purchase price. We've got carrying cost per year. I'll talk about that. We've got a projected sales price. And our anticipated holding period. And what we're going to be basically looking for is what is the internal rate of return. All right, so we've got a couple of different options. Let's say option A and option B. All right. So here are the variables. Let's kind of go through each one of them. The purchase price, that's obvious, okay? How much did we pay for it? So let's start off with that. Okay, so for option A, we can purchase this piece of land, let's say for $5 million. Purchase this piece of land for $2.5 million. Okay? Now, this next variable we haven't really talked a lot about. It should be somewhat obvious what it is in the sense of carrying cost per year. So if you own land, what do you have to pay for?
Property tax.
Property taxes each year.
Insurance.
What else do you have to pay for?
Insurance.
Maybe insurance in case somebody gets on the property and hurts themselves or whatever. What else might you pay? If it's raw land.
Landscaping.
Landscaping or keeping it mowed and maintained and that sort of thing. Okay, anything else that you can think of?
Like, what about like water or any of that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, if it's obviously somewhere in the middle of the city, yeah, and she sort of said, you know, landscaping, but water, you know, keeping it, you know, that aspect. But you get the idea. Carrying costs are just simply what are those, excuse me, expenses that you're going to have to own that land, you know, each month or each year. Okay? So, in this case, let's just say that it's, I'm just going to give you some dollar amounts here. Let's say 150,000 over here. And then, yeah, we'll just have it. 75,000 over here. Okay? All right? Now, at some point in the future, we're going to sell it. Okay? So let's go and talk about our anticipated holding period. We can go with what we have traditionally used. Let's just say 5 years. But in terms of how much we're going to sell it for, so let's just say that after 5 years, we can sell this one for $6 million, and this one for $3.5 million. Okay, both have gone up by basically $1 million. All right, so now what we want to do is we want to calculate the internal rate of return for each of these. Now, what I will tell you, just off the bat, the most common mistake is people treating the carrying cost as income, not as expenses.
Oh.
Okay? In other words, making it a positive number instead of a negative number is the most common mistake. All right? So, let's sort of set these up real quick. Okay, one payment per year. 5 million, and that's a purchase, so that's going to be a cash outflow to us. So we're going to make that as our negative present value. 150,000 is also going to be a negative payment. The 6 million is going to be a positive future value, and our term is going to be 5 years, and we're going to be solving for the internal rate of return, or in this case, the interest rate. Okay? Now you're going to do the same exact thing for the second parcel. Okay, let's see what we get. Not a very good return. That is not a 92% return. That is a 0.92% rate of return. In other words, less than 1%. Okay? And the reason is we've got a lot of outgoings with the holding cost.
Dr. Corey,
Yep.
is REE supposed to have a 6 million future value, or is it supposed to be 3.5?
Oops, thank you. Getting ahead of myself. Okay. Okay, this one you do a little bit better, or actually a lot better, relative terms. 4.3357%. So from the standpoint of which one would we prefer, clearly the one on the right, in the sense that it generates a much higher internal rate of return for us. Obviously, once again, just to make sure that we are clear, this 0.92 is simply as slightly less than 1% per year annualized, whereas the other one is 4% annualized. Okay.
So the question would be, which piece of land is better to buy?
Or provide me with internal rates of return for both of them. So one of the things on this quiz that's going to be a little bit different is a couple of the questions will require two answers. Like this one is an example. And so what you will simply do is, I've set it up to where, unfortunately, I couldn't figure out a way to have it grade both answers, so it's just going to be an open box for you to be able to type in both answers, and then I'll have to obviously physically grade it, which is not that big
So
a
like
deal.
put comma, like one comma the other?
Yeah, or just put
Who doesn't let you?
parcel A is this, parcel B is this. Okay? All right. Now, so let's say you've got what we just did. And you're saying, you know what? I'm not happy with either of those two returns. That 0.92, not even going to consider it, okay? And 4%, I'm not happy with that either. So my question to you, which would be kind of the next question on the quiz, would be assume, assume your hurdle rate for investing is 10%. What is maximum you would pay up front for each property? Okay? See if you can figure out what you need to do. It's not that complicated. I want to leave you alone on it instead of just telling you. Give you a couple minutes to go through it.
Is this like hurdle rate from the end of?
Yep. So in other words, hurdle rate, for those of you that are new to that, is just simply saying that's your minimum required rate of return is 10%. And you want to get something equal to or greater than 10%.
And we're keeping the same future value, all these same numbers?
All that's the same, so you're only really going to be changing one to solve for another one. I just want to see if you can figure it out on your own without me having to tell you.
It's the same word meaning for discount rate. Right?
You just replace the interest rate with 10%.
Yes, you do. You replace the interest rate with 10%, and then you resolve for present value. Okay? So, as an example.
Not net present value?
Nope, because here all the cash flows are the same. So basically what you can do, if you want to just sort of start each one fresh, you could say 150,000 negative payment, 600,000 or 6 million future value, 5-year term, 10% as the interest rate or hurdle rate, solve for present value. And then do basically the same thing over here for the other one, 75,000. $3.5 million. %. Okay, so let's see what we get.
Got 3,156,910 for A, and then 1,888,916 for property B.
I got the same thing.
Okay, so 31,56,909 for A. And 1,888,915.62. Okay? Okay, everybody good?
And we have to put a minus or not?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is all I'm asking for is how much would you pay for it. So, all right. Any questions? Are we good? Nice, warm, fuzzy feelings on the inside?
No.
Okay. All right. Last one for the day. Woo! Okay. All right, so any questions about that before we finish up the last one? Okay. All right, kind of an extension, really, kind of this previous one. So let's say that we've got a property and we bought it, or we want to buy it, and we kind of have the leases and how much income that we think we're going to be able to make on the property over the next 6 years. So we've estimated that out using Argus, let's say, and we have figured out that in year one, after everything is said and done, we're going to have before tax cash flow, or NOI, whichever we choose to use. Let's say we have $250,000. And the next year,
This is income?
income, 275. Oops. Okay, so income's kind of going up, then it kind of is going down, okay? Not for any good reason, I just felt like that. Okay, now, so at the end of 6 years, let's say that we anticipate that we can sell this property for $4 million. The question is, how much can we buy it for up here, assuming a 7.5% hurdle rate or required rate of return? So this one, you're going to have to use the cash flow function. Unlike the previous one, where you were able to get by with just using present value, payment, so forth, so on. Okay? So, if you know what to do, get to it. If not, wait for a couple of minutes and I'll walk you through it.
Cash flow with the CF to 0.
Correct. That's going to be the most common mistake. Okay. Let's- All right, so this is going to be one payment per year, since it's annual. all right? If you want to, we can go ahead and put the interest rate in, 7.5% interest rate. Now then, for our first cash flow, here at time period 0, this is the most common mistake that people make, is they put the 250 in as their first cash flow. No, your first cash flow is going to be 0, because nothing at the moment is happening at time period 0, so that's going to be the first cash flow. Then, cash flow for period 1 will be the 250,000, followed by 275, 300, 350, 325. Now then, for the final cash flow, those of you that once again have been kind of through this song and dance before, what this is saying is your final year is going to be a combination of the income the property is generating plus the sale price or the reversion value. So you can add the two together and you would end up with 4.3 million as your final cash flow. And then since we've already put in the interest rate up there, now it is simply a matter of solving for net present value, and we should get our answer that we're searching for. So let's just see.
And this is, you can continue on the calculator for the addition, right? The 4 million plus 300.
Yes.
$3,986,709.
Yes. 3,986,709.05. Okay? So, that is the maximum amount that we'd be willing to pay for the property up front, assuming these cash flows and that sale price. Now, just for fun, put in 0 as the interest rate, and then resolve for net present value. And you get 5.8 million. Now, all that number represents is that is just simply adding all of the cash flows, including the sale price together. That's the total amount of income the property is generating, not discounting. So, but what we're actually searching for is obviously the discounted value of the 3.986 million. Okay? Any questions?
Can you repeat what the 5,800,000?
That's just adding all the cash flows together.
Oh, that's just
Okay? Because it's a 0% discount, so therefore nothing has been adjusted. Okay? All right. Any questions on any of this? Still good?
You know, on that problem, you really gotta make sure your calculator is cleared out.
Yes, you do. Always clear out your calculator.
I don't get an answer for anything.
All right. Anybody else? Here, there, anywhere? We're obviously got a little bit of time left over, so we can talk about whatever you want to, or we can be done. I'm happy to talk as much as you want and answer any questions about anything you have questions about. So,
Can we revisit the big complicated one? The revenue and expenses as like a simplified form kind of thing.
okay. So, which part do you want me to start with?
Well, we figured out the revenue comes before expenses, but we did the expense one, the expense calculation. It was just the order that we wrote it down kind of stuck with me.
Okay, let's just do another one from scratch. Different numbers, different maybe timeline. All right, so let's just say that we've got it monthly. So we've got months 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. And so let's say that our expenses, they could be anything, but let's just say they're $50,000 or $5,000. Let's just keep the number small. $5,000 a month, maybe for the first 4 months. And then the income is maybe, let's say, $7,000 a month. For basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 months. So you've got 4 months of 4 months of expenses, 8 months of income. So see if you can work that one, and we'll assume that on the front end, let's say a 2% discount rate for those, and a 6% discount rate for the income. And find me basically the net present value for that. Yeah? So this will be a good little test primer. This is all monthly, by the way. Monthly. So, whereas the other example was annual.
The first thing to do is change the calculator.
Yep. So first thing, yes.
It's a 6% discount on income,
Don't we need a third?
and there's no purchase.
Don't we need a third?
Okay. I'll let you guys vegetate on that for a couple of minutes.
Professor, we would use the same setup if the cash flows were mix and match. For example, if
No.
we didn't
Well,
have,
if they're mixed and matched, you're forced to use the cash flow function. Whereas here, you can avoid using the cash flow function because they're all the same.
okay.
And on the quiz, they're all the same, so you're not going to have to use cash flow.
We could do 12N instead of 12 shift N, right, for the time?
Well, you're doing 12 payments per year, so you would only have to do just whatever the number of months are.
Right, because you switch the calculator to 12 PYR.
Okay, so let's start with the easy ones. So we've got 5,000 negative payment, 2% for 4 months. And here, you're just going to do 4 in. If you do 4 shift in, it's going to be 48 months, okay? So be careful on that. And then solve for present value. Okay, so basically our present value of expenses, 19,916.94. Okay? Everybody good with that? Okay, so it's the next part that is the potentially tricky part. So clear everything out. And we've got, what was it, 7,000? Yeah, 7,000. $7,000 of income, positive payment at a 6% discount rate And that 7,000 is occurring for 8 months, so 8N. So the first piece of this is just simply solving for the present value. Then we get 54,760. 71. Okay, now, this is the part that, as I said, usually gets a little bit, difficult to understand. So what that's doing, that first calculation is telling us what is the value of that $7,000 received for the next 8 months here, basically at the end of month 4, in this case. And so it is the 54,760, 71. So now what we've got to do is we've got to discount that back 4 months. Okay. So clear everything out. And then put in the 54,760, 71 as our future value at 6%. But we're discounting it back by 4 months. So present value. Then we get 53,679.05. Not much of a difference because it's only a few months, not a few years. Okay. So present value of income or revenue is going to be 53,679.05. Subtract out the expenses. $33,762.11 would in essence then be, in this case, sort of our profit.
Is the question what the profit is, or is the question what the present value is?
That all depends on what I ask.
Okay.
Okay?
So discounting back 4 months is the same thing as finding the revenue.
Well, I'm sorry?
Discounting backwards from the present value of from total income is the same as finding the revenue for the entire.
Right. We're finding the present value of the revenue here by discounting it back by those extra 4 months.
For all 12 months.
Well, okay. Once again, it's a 2-step process. The first part of the process is to discount the $7,000 a month for 8 months back to here at end of month 4. Then we've got to discount it back to time period 0 in order to make it comparable, and that's where it's like 53,000. Okay?
So finding the 54,000 is considered discounting back. Okay.
Yeah, both of them are discounting back. It's just one is only discounting it back to period 4, but the second piece is discounting it back to the beginning at time period 0.
So you're not adding, at no point are you thinking that there's 53 and a 54. The 54 becomes the 53 essentially.
Yes, precisely. It is transformed into the 53 because you're discounting it further. Okay?
Just that when we do that second step, when we take the 54,000,
Right.
then we don't take the minus anymore.
Well, it's not so much about the minus, it's about what the discounted value is. Don't get hung up on the plus and minus on this. Okay, any other questions?
So, and Professor, in the quiz, you might ask for the present value for the expense, and you might ask for the present value of revenue, and you might ask as well for the profit, right?
That is correct. That is correct. Okay? All right. Any other questions on anything? Nobody else from the gallery wants to ask anything else? Okay. Alrighty.
Can you scroll down a little bit more, please? Yeah, there seems a lot easier than. Oh, okay, now I understand. Because it was, what did I explain?
Okay. Okay, somebody wrote a message, I can't read it from over here. What does it say? How do I change my calculator? Okay, 12 payments per year. Just like I did at the beginning of this problem. Basically, the very first step is just simply taking 12 shift payments per year, and what that does is that changes the calculator to 12 payments per year. If you want to go back to 1 payment per year, then it's simply 1 shift payment per year, go back to annual. Okay?
Can't get one answer.
Okay. What's this?
I can't see that. I know what it is.
Okay. All right. Looks like there are a couple of other little chat questions in there. I can't. Hold on. Let's see what they say. Oh, oops.
You need to put the timer on. I can see how much time you use it for the things.
For what?
Like, I think this is 45 minutes. And the time on.
Is the test available, sir?
I'm sorry?
Then you know it should be at least half.
Is it available now?
Oh, the timer's on the side.
Okay, I'm sorry, what are you asking?
The quiz available.
It automatically
But
unlocks
for some
at
reason today, like, it's
11:15.
not.
At 11:15, okay. Cool, thank you.
Do you do
Okay, any other final questions, comments?
No, this is my first class.
Okay.
So it's really.
On this last topic, just to wrap it up, if you have, just to solidify my understanding, if you have different, like we were saying before, if it's mix and matching and we're using the cash flow function, we're obviously not going to have 2 different discount rates at all. We're just going to apply 1 discount rate to that in that circumstance.
That is where you are wrong. Okay, since you brought it up, and I actually, let's go ahead and do this because I think it is valuable to do it. All right, so we're going to come up with a brand new problem here. After this, I promise we'll be done. Those of you that, for whatever reason, if you're disinterested, well, you can, sign off, but those of you that actually want to learn this in a different way. All right, so let's just say we'll keep it relatively straightforward. Let's say we do it over annual over 5 years. Keep the number of calculations. So let's just say for the first 2 years, we spent, let's say $100,000 in the first year. We spent $150,000 in the second year. In terms of income that we received, we got, let's say, 175. We got 185 and 195. Okay, so all of those are different. All right, so now we are forced to use the cash flow function to do these, all right? Or at least part of them, okay? So what I would do is I would separate into 2 separate problems. And the first problem, once again, 1 payment per year. And the first one would, and it's also gives our interest rate. So let's say this is 3%, and this is 7% for the income. All right, so we put in 3% as our interest rate. Then we would put in 0 as a cash flow. Then we would put in 100,000 negative as a cash flow. 150,000 negative as a cash flow. Then we would simply solve for net present value. Okay, start with that. We end up with 238, 476, 77. Okay, so that is basically the present value of expenses. Okay, so 238, 476, 77. So now we need to solve for the present value of the revenue stream. Okay, is everybody with me so far? Okay, so there's nothing really different about that piece of it, other than the cash flow function. Okay, now, so for this next one, clear everything out. This, we're going to have 7% as our discount rate. But here's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to say 0 as cash flow for time period 0, 0 for cash flow 1, 0 for cash flow 2. Then we start picking up our income in period 3 of 175. Then 185. Then 195 as our cash flows. Okay, once we've got all of those, then solve for net present value.
So there's 3 zeros because of obviously the starting point before month 1 or
Correct.
year 1.
Correct. What this does,
That's the 3 months of expenses.
right, but we can't mix it. Okay, so now what we've got is our present value of our revenues is 423,020,05. Now, what some of you should be saying is, wait a second, you didn't have to do that extra little step. You didn't, because this took care of it for you by using the cash flow function. So in one sense, it simplified it. Okay?
I'm saying we could have done that, sir, right? We could have dropped it into year 2 and then used the future value, used that as future value and brought it back to year 0.
Right.
Okay, good. Because that's what I did. I just ended up with the same number.
Okay, so 184, 543, 28, basically sort of our profit. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so it's just a different way of approaching it, but that basically, all you got to do is make sure that for whatever periods that you've got expenses, that you just eradicate those out of this piece of it so it doesn't skew the results. Okay, does that answer your question, Alex?
It does, and I'm sorry to be a pain, I just have one more question. What if you have, for example, a cash flow, cash outflow, cash inflow, cash outflow?
No, I knew you were going to ask that.
I was just thinking the same thing.
Would it be like, would you do the same thing, but it would be like
Yes.
0, 100, like 100,000, 0, and then just do the same thing?
You would separate them out.
We're going on Wall Street.
whenever they occur, and so, like if it was, like if every other one was an outflow, every other one was an inflow, you'd have two bifurcated, streams of cash flows, calculate, and basically there's a whole function in Excel that will, in essence, do that. Gets into, you put in your financing rate and your sort of, your discount rate, and ultimately you can achieve kind of the same thing. But the whole idea is to get, and what it allows you to do is to calculate kind of like what's called a financial management rate of return or modified internal rate of return kind of thing, and to be more accurate and reflective of what's really going on. Because the problem is, and what Alex is sort of getting at is, hypothetically, let's say that we have a property, and this is a very real possibility, that you've got a property that, let's say that you spent $100,000 buying it, okay, and then in that first year you did some more renovations, so maybe you spent another $10,000 on renovations, and your first year of income is here, and maybe you get $50,000 of income, maybe you get another $50,000 of income, and then here, maybe you have to spend some more money to basically keep it operating, and then here, maybe once again you get $60,000 of income, and maybe you sell it for $150,000. Well, if you put that in just pretty much as we normally would on the calculator, or even in Excel, just kind of like this, and solve for internal rate of return or net present value, you're going to get numbers that don't make any sense for the most part because of that mixture of inflows and outflows. And so the best way to deal with that is to do what we have done just now with the cash flows, and you would sort of isolate all of the outflows and sort of create one discounted cash flow for those, and do the same thing for the inflows and isolate those as well. Okay?
So do the net present value, and then at that for two shacks, and then afterwards combine them.
Yep. And here's what we're going to do. I will promise you, I will give you a problem like this, not on this quiz, but in a future class session, because obviously Alex brought it up, and I think it's a great concept that we probably should explore.
Thanks, dude.
So, no, that's not a bad thing. So, anyway, we will get to that a little bit later. All right. Any other questions? We're pretty much, I think, out of time at this point, unless you got anything else.
So the only confusing part about the original class problem was that the numbers ended up being a loss rather than a profit.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
That explained it all.
Can you scroll back up?
Yeah.
So there?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Okay, we're done, unless you, once again, have anything else you want to ask.
I have a question. I know you're gonna be like so annoyed by me, but I swear, I don't think it's me. I swear, I think it's the calculator, just like last time. I literally can't get one answer. Like I understand the concepts of everything, no problem, but I can't actually do anything. I just want to do it.
Which problem was that?
All of the ones that we do math for. So 1, 2, 3, 8, 9, and 10. I was not able to get one. I understand exactly what to do. I just am not getting one answer. So I'm obviously doing something wrong. I just don't know. This is the one I'm supposed to be hitting, right? For shift.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, show me what you're doing.
So I take 12, right?
Do you mind if I listen in?
Oh, yeah. So I take 12, and then I do it for a year, right?
You're missing the shift.
I have to do shift first. So I just go
You
down.
did clear, you didn't do shift.
Oh, so shift here,
Yep.
and then 12. So shift.
No,
No.
okay.
I don't
Clear everything out,
need a
okay.
calculator.
12,
Mhm.
shift, then payments per year. Top row of the calculator for you.
Yeah.
No, payments per year, underneath the.
Oh, sorry. So 12, shift, payments per year.
Okay,
Okay.
now you're ready.
Mhm.
Shift, clear all. Okay, you're set. Okay.
Oh, that's just like set you.
Yep.
Okay. So then you do 500
Yep,
plus or minus.
that's 50.
Oops, sorry. Plus or minus.
Yep,
PV,
yep, yep,
and then 75
yep. Plus minus,
plus or minus
payment,
payment.
okay, and 12 in. And then 8%. Yep,
No,
8%,
no,
top
no.
row, second key. Okay, and then hit future value.
Oh, that's what I'm doing wrong. That's what I was doing wrong.
So that's why, like, when I add the notes, when I do them, I always add the little square thing right when he adds.
I don't know what your square even means.
That means shift.
Oh, and I was like, is it the blue one or the red one?
No, that means shift. It's always this one.
So hit it here.
Yes, and that's why he always adds the little square thing in the box.
So I don't need this.
No, not at all.
Okay, so for this one,
Cause see, that's why he adds that, because that means shift.
so for this one I do 1.
Yes.
Shift.
Payments per year. Did you do payment?
I
Okay,
did.
payments per week, okay.
Payment per year.
Then he went the,
Shift
clear all.
again,
Mhm.
clear all. And then 1, 2, 5, payment, 5, shift, and top, 5,
interest rate,
top, yeah, and then.
PV. It's all for PV.
So I think that's what I'm doing wrong, is I'm hitting equal.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
I just am like stuck in algebra or something.
No,
Just hitting
that's-
equals instead
no,
of the actual
yes.
what you're solving for.
Yes. But I feel like you have it now. Now that you know what that means as well.
I was just like, I knew where to plug the numbers in, but it's like this.
Yeah, the calculator.
Yeah.